Thank you all for joining us for this roundtable response to the Papal Apology to the First Nations, Métis and Inuit people of Turtle Island, on whose land we are guests. Where I am, I'm located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, and Inuit, whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our own vibrant culture. So I am Doris Keyser. I will be one of your co-hosts today for this panel roundtable. I guess it's a roundtable, not a panel, along with Jane Barter. And we're so thrilled to be hosting our four folks offering reflection, but also all of you for some recognition of what this moment means to the Canadian Church in general. So we have four panel members today. Archbishop Boland from Regina.
I did want to hear this one.
Oh, okay, good. Christine Jameson from Concordia University, Daryold Winkler, who's a pastor at St. Basil's Parish in Ottawa, and Jeremy Bergen from Conrad Grebel University College. Each participant will offer a brief reflection on the meaning of Pope Francis's apology for them, and we will engage in dialogue. Also, following our first presentation, we will then watch the apology on here. We have a clip of that. It's about 13 minutes, and then we'll carry on into the rest of our participants' reflections. So our first respondent is the Most Reverend Bolen, who's the Archbishop of Regina, and he has been since 2016. Archbishop Boland is the chair of the CCCB Episcopal Commission for Justice and Peace, and his motto is mercy within mercy within mercy. He's a scholar and an author in the areas of ecumenism and peace and justice, and he recently accompanied a delegation of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people of Canada to the Vatican to encounter Pope Francis as a Canadian Catholic bishop. Today, he will offer insights and reflections into his experience, the context for that visit, and reflections on the significance of Pope Francis's apology. So I turn it over to you, Archbishop Boland.
Thanks very much. It's good to be with all of you this morning. I'm joining you from Treaty 4 territory here in Regina. And it's a good thing that it isn't an in-person gathering, because I've come down with a very bad cold, so I've got a very raspy voice, but it's not gonna keep me from this gathering. I look forward to the conversation very much, and I'll keep my introductory comments fairly brief. I'm not presently the chair of or a member of the Bishop's Justice and Peace Commission, so it was a little bit of an older CV, but I was in that role at the time when the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was released, and therefore involved in the drafting of the texts on the doctrine of discovery and on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I would just offer a few introductory comments to maybe set the framework for the discussion, and offer other comments later. When the Truth and Reconciliation final report was released, I met with Indigenous people that I knew, elders, and heard right away from them the importance of Call to Action 58. They wanted Pope Francis to engage, mindful that the Vatican is far from this land, but one Indigenous friend put it this way. She said, when there's a conflict between families in the First Nation world, we want the fathers to be involved in the reconciliation, and we want Pope Francis to be engaged. So I began work on this close to 7 years ago now, and so I'm grateful for the steps we've taken. I would say key issues for us to flag in the discussion. What's the difference between previous apologies that were extended by religious communities or bishops and the Papal Apology? What is the unique possibility for moving forward that comes with a Papal Apology? What needs to be apologized for? So identifying the Catholic Church's role in colonization and the papal bulls from the 15th and 16th century. Our work, the church of the day, leadership in the church in the day, taking part in an assimilation project, which was the residential school system, support for the Indian Act in implicit or explicit ways, and the various kinds of abuses that were suffered in the schools, the separation of children from parents. So that whole cluster, what are the items that need to be apologized for us to move forward? Who should be doing the apology? And what is the vocabulary around the apology? There was considerable feedback from the April 1st apology that it sounded minimizing. It sounded like some people. So who needs to be named as having caused waves of suffering in the residential schools? And then a key question, and one that I think interests all of us, what comes after the apology? The Truth and Reconciliation Report certainly indicates that apologies are starting points, not end points. They create a space for an action plan. So what does that look like? What does it look like in terms of support for survivors and accompanying them in terms of the trauma they carry, the intergenerational trauma? What does it look like in terms of the church standing in solidarity with Indigenous people in the rightful pursuit of their rights? Endorsement of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, but in its details. Sometimes said that agreeing with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is like agreeing with the Beatitudes. It's easy to say, but that's a document which has got transformative capacity. What are the steps following an apology in terms of support for Indigenous languages, culture, traditions, ways, spirituality? And perhaps what's our role in the task of a nation in retelling its story, in really acknowledging that the dominant narrative for this country has been a very diminished narrative, which never included in a meaningful way Indigenous people, the tremendous displacement that came with colonization, and the waves of suffering that were experienced in residential schools. So I would just flag those areas at the outset as possibilities for discussion as we go forward. It's been a privilege to be a part of this process, and a privilege to accompany the delegates, the Indigenous delegates, to Rome, and it was quite an experience to be there. I just add one curious little detail before we watch this clip, was that the decision of the Holy See was that the Pope would speak in Italian, but that a booklet with the text in English would be distributed to people there. So that booklet was distributed to the Indigenous delegates and many of the secondary delegates, but not to the bishops. And so the Pope was speaking in Italian, and our varying degrees of Italian, we were trying to follow it. And and I was sitting beside Archbishop Smith, and neither of us were sure at the end whether he had apologized and what the wording of the apology was. And it was former National Chief Phil Fontaine after the, and then there were the beautiful presentations from the Inuit and Métis and First Nations community. So it was quite a while later, and the Pope says goodbye, and then former National Chief Phil Fontaine bounces over to us with considerable enthusiasm, and it, my question was, did he apologize? And was it a good apology? And he said, yes, look here. So anyway, that was part of the experience. I'm going to leave my opening remarks at that and look forward to the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Archbishop Boland. I'm just so excited about this conversation and our capacity to reflect personally and pastorally upon this event. So thank you for setting the tone for that. At this time, we thought it would be a good idea to watch the apology together, in part because I felt rather bereft when I was watching it alone at home, and I thought, what are all my Catholic friends saying about this? How are they feeling about it? What are my Indigenous friends feeling about this right now? And so we'll have a bit of an opportunity, I hope, in retrospect to talk about our impressions, our reactions, our thoughts on it together as a community. So let me just share a screen. I am happy now to welcome the next speaker. And the next speaker is Christine Jameson, who is Associate Professor of Theological Studies at Concordia University. She is the author of several books and peer-reviewed articles, including Christian Ethics and the Crisis of Gender Violence. She speaks today in response to this apology through her own personal testimony, as well as through her academic insights. So welcome, Christine.
Thank you very much, Jane. First of all, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the Gahaga Nation, which is recognized, who are recognized as the custodians of the land and waters we now call Montreal. So I just have a short time, and there are kind of four things I wanted to comment on. First of all, I want to, from a very personal level, I want to express my experience of this encounter. I know there are, I've heard criticisms, and I'm aware of, possible problematic issues that may emerge in terms of what the Pope said and what he didn't say. But I choose to come at it from more of a positive perspective, of a building up, because I think that is really what is happening here, is that there is a building up, a positive step forward. One of the things, perhaps the thing that struck me the most, was the actual encounter, the face-to-face encounter between the Indigenous delegates and Pope Francis. That encounter did happen. The Pope's own words, he says, "I have listened attentively to your testimonies." And he said, "Listening to your voices, I was able to enter into and be deeply grieved by your stories." So very struck by his encounter with the Indigenous peoples, the Inuit, the Métis, and the First Nations delegation. And his apology, that he did encounter, and through that encounter, he came to the importance of saying these words, that I ask God's forgiveness, and I want to say to you with all my heart, I am very sorry. I am very sorry. So I feel the Pope's sincerity. I experience it in his words. The other thing that I think is important is that he says it, that even though the language difference, he spoke it, and the importance of the oral speaking it to the Indigenous peoples there. I am sorry, I apologize. And even though it was a different language, still the words themselves, I think, were important. The second thing I wanted to note was that through that encounter, meaning was constituted. Bernard Lonergan, in his book Method and Theology, talks about meaning he's as embodied and carried in different aspects. He says meaning is embodied and carried in human subjectivity, in art, in symbolism, in language, and in the lives and deeds of persons. And each one of those aspects of meaning, intersubjectivity, art, symbolism, language, the lives and deeds of persons, was constituted, I believe, in this encounter. I was very struck by that. But particularly this idea of incarnate meaning, the meaning of a person's life, the meaning of a person's life and deeds. And it seems to me that that meaning of the persons themselves and Francis himself, it happened, it was constituted. And I think that was very important. Quickly, I just want to say what struck me about the encounter and what I think needs to happen as we move forward is attentiveness to the Anishinaabe 7 sacred teachings, or the 7 grandfather or grandmother teachings. How these are really, I think that these express a core value of what it means to have good relations. And these sacred teachings are not prohibitions. They're not about what one does wrong, but it's really about how we can obtain the good life, how we can be in relationship with each other in a good way. So respect for others, the earth, and for oneself. Respect in the sense of deeply cherishing each other, of being willing to take a second look, not immediately jumping to conclusions, but being willing to take a second look and understanding the other. Humility, truth. Truth here is the sound of the heart, in the sense of speaking from the heart. And it strikes me that this happened during this encounter, speaking from the heart. Honesty, wisdom, seeing more fully in that sense of wisdom. Love, which includes ideas of pity, empathy, and deep unconditional love. And bravery, to be strong-hearted. And I was very struck by the strong-heartedness of the delegates who came to Rome to meet with Pope Francis. Very struck by that. This final thing I want to say is, and this is in relationship to what happened and what's going to happen, because it seems to me that when the delegates went to Rome, they entered the Pope's lodge. They entered his lodge. They got to know something about who he was, in a sense, by visiting his lodge. And now he's coming to visit the Indigenous peoples in Canada, their lodge. And I think that there's something important about recognizing the importance of entering into each other's lodge to come to know. And I think that this is the beginning, as many have said, this is the beginning of new paths to be pursued together. So I think this entering of each other's lodge will be a kind of a coming around where we can begin to move forward with these new paths to be pursued together. Thanks.
Thank you, Christine. That was a wonderful, lovely, and comprehensive reflection on the apology, and I look forward to the conversation that comes from that. Next, we have Father Daryold Winkler, who is the pastor at St. Basil's Church in Ottawa. He's an Ojibwe priest and a previous colleague and still friend of mine at St. Joseph's College. Father Daryold is involved in the Kateri Native Ministry in Ottawa, and I am delighted to welcome him here today. In the midst of an internet outage all over Ottawa, he made his way to the high school so he could be with us today to reflect on the meaning of Pope Francis's apology for him. So Daryold, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Doris. My name is Daryl Corbier Winkler. I've been an ordained priest for 25 years now. I began with the Basilian Fathers and I'm still very close to them, but my journey in life took a shift and I became incarnated. I joined the priests in the Archdiocese of Ottawa. I'm one of 7 priests who identify as Indigenous in Canada. And my mother was an Ojibwe woman, Anishinaabekwe, from Manitoulin Island. She came from one of the 6 First Nations communities on that island. The community that I'm a member of is called Chiging First Nation. It's right in the center of Manitoulin Island. Like many people in the 50s, my mother went to Chicago to look for work. Where she lived, there was no economic development. And so in the late 50s, she went to Chicago. Her brothers brought her there, helped her get there. And while she was there, she met someone who would become my dad, my father. So I was born in Chicago, like many Ojibwe Manitoulin people, born there. I was speaking to a Jesuit a long time ago, Michael Murray, who said, well, that pattern, that migration around the Great Lakes was probably millennia old. And so it's not unusual that they would find themselves in Chicago and return and all that kind of thing. I grew up in Illinois. I grew up in a small rural area where my mother was the only Native person for miles and miles around. And we were, her children. It wasn't until my parents separated when I was in grade 10, we moved to the Sioux, and there I discovered, other Native people besides my mother. And I recognized that she cooked food that I thought she made up, but turns out that all kinds of Native people ate the same kinds of things that we grew up on. And but I also learned too that there was a racism in the Sioux against Native people there that I had not been accustomed to. And I saw it very clearly as, the son of this woman who experienced racist attitudes and behaviors while we were in the Sioux. I want to share with you 3 quick stories. The first is about my mother. She attended an Indian day school in her community, and she had a hard time learning English. Her first language was Ojibwe, Anishinaabemowin, and she had a hard time learning. She was slower than everybody else in her class, in her school. And the teacher was asking her a question, and they were doing catechism, Baltimore catechism, question and answer. And she asked my mother, and my mother didn't know how to respond. She didn't understand. And so the teacher said, well, why are you so hard to learn English? Why do you have to be a pig, coconche? And her best friend, who later became my godmother, was said to my mother later, because my mother didn't understand. She said, she called you a pig. And my mother, who was an 8-year-old girl, said, she called me a pig. My teacher called me a pig. She couldn't believe it. And it was such a feeling of degradation. She never told us that story. It was too embarrassing for her. But this kind of degradation is what she experienced in the educational system, even in the day schools. The second story I want to share is with my aunt, my mother's youngest sister. And she had attended the residential school in Spanish, Ontario. And when she was about 12 years old, she had 2 good friends, and they decided to run away. They wanted to leave the school. And the 3 of them had made a plan. When the bell rang, and there was lots of commotion in the school, they were going to run across the field and go into the bush, and then leave the school, run away. So they're all anticipating this bell ringing, and they're scared, the 3 of them. And then the bell rings, and 2 of them rush across the field, running across the field, hoping not to be seen, and enter into the bush. And halfway there, they realized my aunt wasn't coming with them. She froze. She couldn't move. She was so terrorized by the idea of running away and all of these things. She just stood there, and the 2 girls continued, and they went into the bush. And my aunt told me that she'd never heard from them again. She's now 76. She doesn't know what happened to those 2 girls, but she was too terrorized to run away. The third story is my uncle. In more recent years, there was an opportunity for some restitution for his experience, but he had to write a narrative, what is called a narrative, some of his stories. And he asked for help. So I was helping him write down these stories. And one of them, I'm just going to share one of them. He was 8 years old. And, you know, boys, whatever culture they're from, they horse around, they play, they run after each other, they wrestle, all this kind of thing. And that's what he was doing. And the teacher was really angry and said, come forward. So my uncle came forward and he said, hold out your hands. And he took a ruler and smacked his hands. So much so that the swelling in his hands were so, they were like, he couldn't bend his fingers. They were that swollen. It lasted for several days. So this kind of brutality was the experience. So my mother and my aunt and my uncle, they know trauma. These were very trauma. I'm just giving you 3 stories. And this could be multiplied across the country of the kind of things that people remember, survivors remember, these traumatic experiences of degradation and humiliation, stories of violence and brutality, you know, beating, stories of terror, of fear. And this is what, and that all produced trauma, you know. And I remember when I was writing this story down for my uncle, this is about a year ago, I was so shocked by these stories, and I came back to Ottawa and I told my brother, I said, I got these stories that our uncle told us. And he said, Daryl, we heard those stories before when we were teenagers. And after they'd been drinking for a little while, these stories would emerge. When inhibitions became lowered, for some reason, some of these stories would come back. And I tried to remember, it came back to me, some of these, I remember as a teenager hearing some of these stories, but I thought they were exaggerated. I couldn't believe that they could be real, that these were, I felt all of these kinds of stories that I heard from the generation preceding me were all exaggerated. I couldn't believe it. I minimized what they were telling. And now as an adult, much older, you know, now I begin to realize that this is the attitude that they've faced in telling their stories. Minimization, exaggeration. It wasn't that bad. You're exaggerating. And yet when they retell those stories, it's as if it happened yesterday. The trauma comes right back. And that's why during the TRC events that that happened across Canada, they had to have people there to help in case they were triggered again. Even Murray Sinclair said that, you know, his wife, I remember hearing his wife say once that after he went through those events, he would disappear. He would be silent. He couldn't talk. He'd go into his basement and just remain in darkness because it took so much to process these stories of trauma and abuse and neglect and shame and all of it. So this is what I'm growing to realize is that this trauma was passed down to us. And because parents can only give you what they have. And what my mother had was a story of a little girl and a woman who became traumatized, who was traumatized, who believed the colonial attitudes that she was told over and over again, that she was inferior, that her spirituality was inferior, that everything about her was less than, and she believed it. My mother died in '87, long before the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples or the TRs or any of those things. She died a woman who believed she was inferior because of her ethnicity. So this trauma has been passed, and I've had to go through my own healing journey. All of us, you know, my siblings, I see the trauma into the next generation, my nephews and my nieces and the cousins of, you know, my aunts, and it's being passed down, though we are trying to decolonize our thoughts, our minds, into believing that we were not inferior, that our ways were just simply different. and something that the Pope acknowledged in his apology. I am just going to end with this. A lot of Murray Sinclair said that, reconciliation, we're still in the foothills. We've got to climb this mountain. That's the journey we have to experience yet. The journey of reconciliation we have a long ways to go. And there's going to be lots of resistance. There's going to be lots of people who minimize, people who disbelieve the experiences of those who share their stories, people who don't think this matters. And I'm really thankful that this Canadian Theological Society is having a reflection on this experience of trauma, the importance of reconciliation, and in our church. And in our diocese in Ottawa, the bishop is renting buses so that the Indigenous people here can go to Quebec City to listen to the Pope's apology. And I'm going to be on one of the buses that goes there. And when I hear the Pope and can see him with my eyes and hear the words, as Dr. Jameson mentioned, hear his words, I'm going to hold on to those. And it's for my mother. Like, for me, this is a personal, visceral thing, this talk of reconciliation. It's not just theoretical or abstract. For me, it's deeply personal. And I'm going to take that apology and pray that my mother receives the healing now in the spirit world that she didn't get when she was here. And it's for my uncle and for my aunt and my siblings and my nieces and nephews. It's an opportunity for us to attain some level of healing from our own inherited experiences that come to us from, our parents and so forth. So that's what I would say. That's what I have to say. For me, this papal apology that we heard and what we'll hear in Canada is a symbolic, huge step forward. I know it's going to be a healing experience for Catholics, Indigenous Catholics. It will be for me. And I'm just praying that we can continue this path of reconciliation and help each other in our healing journeys. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you so much, Daryl, for your very personal and thoughtful and reflective consideration of what this apology might mean for you, for your community, for your family, and deeply grateful for what you've shared with us today. We're going to have one more panel or person reflecting, and that is Dr. Jeremy Bergen. Dr. Bergen is at the Conrad Grebel University College in Waterloo, at part of the University of Waterloo. He's a previous president of the Canadian Theological Society, and his work has investigated church apologies for historical wrongs and is currently considering how suffering and martyrdom as framed by Christian churches have implications for the church's responses to other victims of violence. So today he's going to offer his reflections on the papal apology that we heard earlier. So very happy to have you here, Jeremy, and please go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you for this invitation. I'm just really very honored to be part of this conversation and to add my voice, however it might be helpful. I speak as a white settler whose Russian Mennonite ancestors settled on the dispossessed Indigenous lands of Treaty 1 and Treaty 7. And I now live on the Haldimand Tract, the traditional territory of the Neutral, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee people. My own late grandfather served for 1 year as a teacher in the United Church-run Indian Day School in Cross Lake, Manitoba, which was his assigned service as a conscientious objector to the Second World War. I have been researching and writing about church apologies for historical wrongs for over 15 years. And in the past year, I have been much more public about some of this work, including writing for the Globe and Mail, a response piece in The Conversation on the day of the apology, and in some other media appearances. I am an insider to the Christian tradition, but I'm not Roman Catholic. And I intend my comments as constructive, and I also speak critically and constructively into my own Mennonite tradition, which I think the Papal Apology challenges me to do. So let me make 5 very brief reflections about the apology itself. First, what an apology means, and therefore what an apology is not determined strictly by the words that are spoken, nor, I would add, by the analysis of experts. The words are important, absolutely, but not everything. What comes after is obviously of very great importance, and also what comes before, and the context more generally, including, I think, in this case, I think it should be noted, a fairly long delay, including authoritative voices who were saying that such an apology wasn't necessary or appropriate. As has been noted, I think the fact that the Pope responded after days of listening to testimony, that encounter, is very significant. And it brings to mind some echoes of the 1993 apology by Anglican Archbishop Michael Piers. I think there's some interesting similarities there. The pastoral tone and the personal connection that emerges from listening is obviously significant. But I think it also highlights the challenge of reception for those who might not have encountered the Pope personally, and for those who may not be able to encounter him personally and directly when he is here in Canada. It is obviously not for me to say anything about how residential school survivors and their communities respond. I simply observe there have been a wide range of responses. But I'm continually struck by the significance of the very fact of an apology and the power of the words, "I am sorry." I've heard this now many times. This is a reminder to me that an apology is an action. It does something. It brings about a different situation. It changes facts on the ground. But of course, it is never the only action that is needed. Secondly, I was somewhat surprised that the apology came when it did and where it did. And some journalists that I spoke to were somewhat surprised as well. But I can also appreciate how the Pope, as pastor, wanted to say something then and there and not just wait. Yet from a distance, and I speak as someone from a distance, there was something slightly unsettling, perhaps, about how this particular apology was on the church's turf, in an ornate room in the Vatican and on the church's terms. And thus, I hope that very careful thought will be given to how and in what context and with what ceremonial sensitivity an apology will be delivered by the Pope on these lands. I think a crucial feature of an apology is for the apologizer to not be in control of the situation. An apology ought to be about undoing some of those relations of power. This is why I believe that referring to forgiveness in an apology has the potential to undermine what an apology needs to do. To ask God's forgiveness, as he did, might imply that it has been granted and perhaps that we can move on. I don't think it needs to be taken that way, but I note that as a danger. And of course, I would also add that, but to ask forgiveness of those he is speaking to can place a burdensome expectation to reciprocate. Third, an apology is public speech and will be judged according to standards and expectations of survivors, their community, and the wider public, and not by those of the church. While the language of repentance, confession, pardon, forgiveness, these are the concepts with which the church is more familiar and more comfortable. Apology, I think, is not the natural language of theology of the churches. But I think churches and theology more generally is being challenged to think about the theological significance of apology. But I sometimes think that this new language partly accounts for why some apologies have not been effective in the past. Nuances of ecclesiology and jurisdiction may be appreciated here among us in this setting, but from the perspective of public reception, it was the church. The church did something, and therefore the church, as represented by the Pope, was called to speak an apology. Fourth, I am therefore concerned, as I think has been noted elsewhere in these meetings, that the Pope's statement did not acknowledge the church as an institution, which embraced and assimilate, that it was the church as an institution that embraced an assimilationist policy in its decision to participate in the running of the schools. He positioned the church as being on the side of outrage and sorrow for the colonization, and as a partner in overcoming it, rather than as an active agent of its perpetuation. Now, I understand some of the ecclesiological barriers to acknowledging the complicity and sinfulness of the church per se, and the 1999 International Theological Commission document, Memory and Reconciliation, remains, I think, a key point of reference for understanding some of those ecclesiological issues, which we can get into. But on a practical level, and in terms of what is needed going forward, it seems that unless a church acknowledges its complicity at a structural level and names specific dimensions of this, there is little reason to believe that follow-up actions will make the kind of structural changes and transformations that are called for. Fifth and finally, many settler Canadians are implicated and complicit on several levels. Churches which ran schools, definitely complicit, my own church included. Some may have personal and family connections as well. But I'm also somewhat concerned that the visit of the Pope, which will rightly focus on the role of the church, perhaps the churches more generally, I'm concerned that it not mitigate the fact that it was the Crown and all settler Canadians, which also have a responsibility for the residential schools and the policy goals which undergirded them. And we are all called to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is not something that would be easy for the Pope or other church leaders to say because it may seem like deflection. But it is also important that settler Canadians, regardless of church or religious affiliation, recognize that this is their complicity too. This is our complicity too. And this calls us to more work, not to less. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. As ever, thoughtful and very helpful in this discussion going forward. So we have a little over 20 minutes for conversation among us. And should any of you have questions for any of our four presenters, we would be happy to entertain those. And we also invite you, if you feel comfortable, to turn on your cameras and join us in conversation with Archbishop Boland, Dr. Christine Jameson, Daryold Winkler, and Jeremy Bergen, and we will entertain any questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand using the hand raise function, because there's I'm not sure that I'll be able to catch everyone if you're just raising your actual physical hand. So does anybody have questions, thoughts, reflections for us? Okay, Ryan Turnbull, go ahead.
My question is just a general one for anybody who wants to answer it. So I presented a couple days ago on St. Madeleine, and one of the things I didn't talk about was that in 1990, they started St. Madeleine Days, where the Catholic Church showed up, the Archbishop of Winnipeg, I believe, and made a very similar kind of apology, focusing on the strength of culture of the Métis people and how their culture had survived, even though what was at issue there was that their actual place had been destroyed and dismantled. And when I listened to the Pope's apology, now for the third or fourth time, I can't help but be struck by once again, the insistence on culture, which seems to me to kind of run afoul of Glenn Coulthard's kind of critique of the fact that we like to recognize culture, but we don't actually want to get at the material harms that, you know, recognizing that the residential schools were part of a displacing and genocidal policy. So I just wonder if these kinds of apologies actually get to the heart of the issue, or if that's something that still isn't being addressed here.
Do any of our panelists have thoughts and reflections that they want to respond to Ryan's comment / question? Archbishop Boland, go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. I wonder if you could just say a little more. I wasn't able to hear your earlier presentation. Acknowledging that residential schools basically suppressed Indigenous language and culture and traditions is a part of the apology. But I'm wondering if you can just give us a lead, give me a deeper understanding into what kind of engagement on the question of culture would help us move forward more.
Well, the issue is that while the schools, of course, attack the language and culture, like the purpose of them is part of a larger kind of colonial displacement policy of the government. So just by zooming in on like, oh, this is an educational thing, and therefore we can think about it in terms of language and culture, kind of misses the actual like force of what this institution was in terms of like a colonial displacing institution that actually has like material reparations in mind, particularly when you get into how much land the churches were given as part of doing this work.
Thanks.
Any other thoughts?
Have much, if I could just comment briefly. I mean, I think it's just very significant that to note that apologies are very powerful ways to frame official narratives, you know, and I'm hopeful that this is a reconciling narrative and an acknowledging narrative, but sometimes in those moments, I think there's also you know, and I would really share your concern, Ryan, and so on, that what's not there can be significant, because this may set the terms for what we're going to be wrestling with as settlers, for example, or as churches and Indigenous people for some time. And so what's there and what isn't there, and how might some of the land dispossession, for example, be relatively invisible in these processes. It's important.
Thanks, Jeremy. If we have no other responses, let's move on to our next question. Robert Cherney, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you. I have two questions. The more straightforward one is addressed to Archbishop Boland. You said that you were part of the bishop's higher level scene when the TRC report came out, and I know that you've been doing all sorts of work behind this. You mentioned just a little bit of it, but I wonder if there's more that you could tell us about the path between 2015 and 2022 that without divulging confidences that might help us understand that a little bit better. And my second question is this: I have the privilege of knowing you from various contexts. We haven't met in person, but also knowing Father Daryl Winkler very well, because he's my parish priest. And to both of you, and perhaps others, my question is this: what is the possibility of real empathy? What is the possibility of real understanding? If I, from my background, which involves very crappy stuff in World War II, which obviously I didn't experience, otherwise I wouldn't be here, but it's a family legacy. I could say to someone, you know, I know what you're talking about, and they might say, well, of course you don't. That was 10 years or 20 years. It wasn't generations. okay? And it was different in nature. And so I would have made a mistake there. I'm claiming that I have true empathy. But I'm searching for what that is and how to do it and so forth. So if either of you or anybody else wants to comment on that, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Archbishop Boland.
Well, thanks very much, Bob, and good to see your face after email correspondence. Yeah, between 2015 and 2022, and there was also a question in the chat, which I think feeds in here. Why did it take so long for the bishops? I mean, I'm sorry that it did. I think that experience of relations between the church and Indigenous peoples in different parts of the country were significantly different. I think that the truth and reconciliation process unraveled a public narrative that we had of this country and of the church and of its missionary engagement. And that TRC narrative has been a challenge for the church to absorb. And for those of us who have the privilege of knowing Indigenous people, of survivors, and could have those firsthand encounters, it was easier to see that one narrative being pulled apart and the need to move towards a different understanding of our history. I think that there's a colonizing model of ministry that's been in place, which wasn't about an encounter between spiritualities. One Indigenous friend in Saskatoon said, when settlers came here, there was a possibility of a rich cultural and spiritual encounter, but mostly that did not happen. One people suppressed another. And our dominant model of ministry hasn't been about a real engagement between spiritualities. And that made it more difficult to move forward and to see the deep wounds that were inflicted by the suppression of language and culture and spirituality. There was no infrastructure for a dialogue between the bishops and the national Indigenous organizations that was really built in the process of preparing the delegation to go to Rome. But I mean, I think in those 7 years, you have bishops from across the country getting their minds around the integrity of the request of Call to Action 58, which was not a quick process. Of course, the delegation would have happened considerably earlier had it not been for COVID. I think that the ground penetrating radar in Kamloops and Cowessess and then across the country moved the conversation forward and applied a lot of public pressure as that TRC narrative became a narrative that the media was putting in front of us in a very challenging way, which brought change and brought action. So I mean, I think that there has been the apology happened when it did. Yeah, and it's taken this long for the Pope for the bishops to engage with the Pope in terms of him coming to this land to offer the apology. I guess I'd leave it at that. Just a word on the second question, and really picking up on what Christine said earlier, the importance of encounter, the Pope being present to survivors having the experience of being heard directly, and the challenge when that's viewed only through the media. So it's interesting to hear you, Daryl, talk about buses going. We're bringing buses from Saskatchewan to Alberta of survivors to be there so that to the extent possible, they can have encountered. And we're trying to create contexts here where there can be a real encounter. But ultimately, it's not just the Pope that Indigenous people need to have an encounter with. It's the local communities where they experience racism continually, where they continue to suffer from, you know, all kinds of ways in which that racism is just embedded societally, structurally. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thanks for a very good pair of questions.
I could,
Daryl?
okay. In terms of empathy, how do we, and I agree with, you know, this idea of encounter and listening to each other. That's part of the ability to create empathy. But soon after the Kamloops incident happened a year ago, there was a parish in this diocese who invited me to come there. I was asked by a group of parishioners to come and do an Indigenous Mass and with Cattery Native Ministry. But there was a faction within this parish that did not want us to do, I don't know what you would call it, a smudging ceremony, because that's how we pray. When here in Ottawa with the Cattery Ministry, we begin with, you know, rite of purification or a smudging ceremony. And there's a group that attended that Mass, and they had placards ready to protest it because they felt it was pagan. And if I were to begin that ceremony at the beginning, because it's a kind of rite of penitential rite, if I were to do it, they were going to hold up their signs and say, this is pagan. Do not bring this into our parish. That's here in Ottawa. That happened not long ago. At the same time, there was a faction in that parish that has desire to learn more. They've done activities, they've studied, they've done research, they've invited Native people to speak. So within the same parish, there is this strange thing happening where some deny, exclude, refer to this Indigenous spirituality as inferior and even pagan, although the term pagan has not been used in official documents in 60 years in any of the church's teachings, but people still think these are pagan. And I don't know this, how do you create empathy when you have this resistance? And this is the resistance I think that Justice Murray Sinclair was speaking about. It's being able to try to open, you have to have an open heart, open mind, willingness to listen and to learn if you're going to create in your own self an empathetic view towards other people and other customs and traditions and spiritual visions. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I might just say a couple words. I agree with Daryl. I think that there's still a lot of what's called spiritual violence, what the TRC called spiritual violence, that continues to happen among Christian churches in Canada in relation to Indigenous peoples who are Christian. So I think that a big part of it is education, because I think that a lot of it is ignorance, really, not understanding the impact of one's attitude towards another. I really truly believe that it is possible to understand another, but I think it requires a certain amount of bravery, a certain amount of willingness to be attentive to that person, to be willing to say to that person, and I'm speaking really personally because we are persons, we're subjects who encounter each other. We're not systems, although we are engaged in systems that create lots of problems, I acknowledge that. But as a person who is attentive to another and can say to the other, what are you going through? You know, who are you and what are you going through? And the willingness to do that, I think, is what has to happen. More and more, we have to open ourselves up to being attentive to the other and being willing to listen to what the other's going through. And it takes a lot of courage, I think. And this is why I referred to the 7 sacred teachings, because I think they so beautifully express how to live in the world in a way that is open to the other. I mean, my own background, which I didn't really talk about, but I'll just mention quickly, is that I'm a member of the Boothroyd First Nation, which is part of the Nklakma people in the Fraser Canyon. So I've done a lot of exploration of my own people over these past, decade or so. And I've come to understand what a different perspective it is. And my, it's really been startling sometimes to see the difference in terms of our understanding, so the Western understanding of even our relationship to the land. But I think it is possible to come to know, to come to understand another worldview. So I just wanted to say that. Thanks.
Thanks, Christine. I'm mindful of the time, and I know, Bob, you've been waiting with your hand up for a bit, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Bob McKeon, to ask your question.
Okay, I'll try to be really brief. And it was mentioned in the panel. The Papal Apology, as previous apologies, apologizes for certain actions of certain individuals in the Catholic Church. In fact, the Catholic Church involvement with Indian residential schools was institutional. By the hierarchical leaders. In Edmonton, we very much reflected on the role of Bishop Grandin, who was really the founding bishop, right, of the Diocese of St. Albert, and the real intellectual and institutional and practical builder of the Indian residential school system. It became institutionalized to a point where the Catholic Church would recruit new generations into sustaining that. It was more than certain individuals, certain abusers. So to think, how can that be voiced? Is a apology systemically from the Catholic Church about its involvement with the schools possible? What does it mean? What would it look like? What actions would follow if that could be voiced? Okay, that's what I would ask.
Okay. Any response? Yeah, go ahead, Archbishop Boland.
I can start, and really following up on things that Jeremy said in this regard as well, in terms of, looking for ways in which we can name who was responsible. So, I think it's responsible for the Pope to apologize for papal bulls in the 15th and 16th centuries, which really sided the church with colonizing powers and not Indigenous peoples. I think it's responsible to apologize for church leadership that agreed to a policy of assimilation, and apologize for the role of religious communities in engaging in this policy of assimilation and suppression of language and culture and the abuses that were suffered. But how do you do that in a way that doesn't move to an ecclesiology, which is basically that the church is fundamentally an institution, not a group of disciples? So I think looking for language, I'm also working at looking for that language, which doesn't throw out an ecclesiology of the church as the people of God, but gives, acknowledges responsibility where it needs to be acknowledged. So any ideas and input in that regard, I'm on the lookout. It's an ongoing desire for myself to find ways to name and articulate the responsibility where it belongs.
Can I say something to that? I could be quite naive. I don't know the inner workings of the CCCB. There's a lack of transparency a lot. I assume the wording about some Catholics being responsible is an issue of liability. It's an issue of money. Who's going to be sued? Who's responsible for paying for that's what I have always understood. This is why we didn't hear the apology sooner. I've always felt that it was a fear of money. Who's going to get sued? Who has to pay? And this concern for money has really controlled a lot of our agenda in the Catholic Church. But I'm not a bishop. I'm not part of the conference. I'm just a pastor. But this is how I've understood all of these workings. It's really bottom line money. Who pays? Who's responsible for paying? And that's why the apology, when I heard that in the Pope's apology, I thought that's legalese. That's not theology. That's not about ecclesiology. That's legal wording to prevent liability. And I think we should be honest. I think the bishops need to be honest about all of this and stop deflecting and be prophetic and say, you know, we've really been worried about liability and not about the healing of our members of our church who have been so traumatized that will take generations to heal them. That's how I feel about it. I don't know. And I don't know why there's so much skirting around it. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. Let's the bishops be honest and really say what's going on and not be, you know, deflecting issues and saying, well, it's this and that and all the other. That's just my own perspective, though it's limited. It's lacking lots of context. It's, you know, for all of the deficiencies that I have from my own small perspective, that's how I feel as an Indigenous person who really has devoted his adult life in ministry in this church.
Thanks, Daryl. That's provocative and perhaps something that many of us have thought historically. So I thank you for voicing that. We're coming to the end of our time, and I know, Nestor, you had your hand up, but I think I'm going to call time for us so that we can all take a break for our next panel. So what I would like to do is to thank Daryold, Archbishop Boland, Christine, and Jeremy for reflecting so personally and so profoundly and theologically on this issue, and also giving us insight into various ways of understanding the apology in the context of the church and how we might be able to take steps towards reconciliation that are meaningful and of course first and foremost mindful of the people of God. So thank you all so much. Thank all of you. I thank all of you for coming this morning, and I encourage you to stay around for our next panel, which will start in about 8 minutes. So you can go get yourself a cup of tea and be back. And again, thank you all so much for this really enriching dialogue. So thank you.